Peter, you've been involved in American higher education for a long time and critical of it, actually, especially in recent years. Is it the best in the world? What's wrong?
Well, I think sort of many of these challenges that we've discussed also apply in the higher education context, where it's probably if you define technology as doing more with less, education is perhaps the most anti-technological aspect of our society today, where you're getting the same at a higher and higher price.
Right.
The real costs of higher education since 1980 have gone up about 400%. It's after inflation, and it's not clear the quality's gone up at all. And so I think
it's hard to even imagine how that is. I mean, it's not. The classrooms are the same, the teachers are the same, the facilities are a little bit better. 400%. It really is a bizarre when you think
well,
about it.
it's on some level. The universities have found that they can just charge more every year, and I think the question is maybe why has there not been more resistance to these price hikes, and I think it again in part goes to this failure of an imagination of an alternate future, and so talented people should all go to the same universities, learn the same things, pursue the same types of careers, and so I think we have if we had an internet bubble or a housing bubble, we certainly have an education bubble today, and bubbles are characterized by things costing more than they're worth. They're characterized by sort of intense psychosocial dynamics, so it's very hard for people to suggest that you should not go to the best college you can get into because people don't know what else to do. So again, this sort of failure of imagination of an alternate future. And bubbles are also characterized by abstractions away from reality. And so I think the word education itself is this incredible abstract filler. And it's worth drilling down a lot more on what is going on, and that's the sort of thing you're generally not allowed to do. So what is it specifically that you're learning?
Right.
So engineering, is it some rigorous humanities course, or is it just education in the abstract? I've often suggested you could think of this in economic terms. You can think of, is education an investment decision where it's basically something you invest to get a better paying job? Is it a consumption decision where it's sort of a four-year party? Maybe it's sort of a combination of a bad investment and bad consumption decision where basically people think they are investing by consuming, which was characteristic of the housing bubble, where you bought an especially large house with a swimming pool and you patted yourself on the back for being an incredibly frugal investor.
Right.
And so there's sort of an aspect of that. But I've come to think that even more than investment or consumption, it's perhaps better to think of education as understood as an insurance policy, where it's probably not worth as much as people are paying for it, but they're scared of falling through the cracks in our society, and so as the cracks get bigger, we pay more and more for insurance against it. That's the way it's advertised. And then I think the reality is that it's the exact opposite of an insurance policy. It is actually sort of this crazy zero-sum tournament in which what really matters is getting into the best schools, and then a diploma from a third-tier university is really a dunce hat in disguise. And so there is. So I think at its core, it's perhaps a zero-sum tournament masquerading as general insurance, and that's incredibly dissonant.
And can it be changed? I mean, as long as I've been, I came here to work in the education department, we thought higher ed was ripe for change, and it doesn't look very different now than it did 25, 30 years ago.
The tone, historically, I think the tone has been set by the top universities. They have these enormously rich endowments, and they are incredibly resistant to influence from the outside. And so I do think it's the kind of thing that's very hard to reform from without. It is nevertheless, I think, heading towards a crisis of sorts, where it simply no longer works for the vast majority of middle-class students who are amassing enormous amounts of debt going to college. And so there is going to be enormous pressure. It's hard to say exactly what the timing on this is, but I think some of the online alternatives, are going to get more traction as these financial pressures start to mount. One of my friends has characterized the university system as the atheist church, which is sort of a successor to the Catholic Church. It's sort of universal, and that the university system in 2014, it's like the Catholic Church circa 1514. There's less diversity, so you have the Dominicans and the Franciscans and all these different orders, whereas the diversity between, say, the Harvard and Stanford political science department is considerably less. But it is sort of, you have this priestly class of professors that doesn't do very much work. People are buying indulgences in the form of amassing enormous debt for the sort of secular salvation that a diploma represents. And what I think is very similar to the 16th century is that the Reformation will come largely from outside. It will, and then at some point maybe there will be some internal need to adapt. Right. But I think the first move will have to come from outside, because you have sort of systems that are so far decoupled from what actually makes sense, and the people are so they're so bought into a system that right. does not work that I think you will see enormous resistance from the faculty.
And I think it seems to me it's a combination of sort of bureaucratic sloth, I guess, and resistance to change on the one hand, and then the political correctness on the other. And I guess they go together more than perhaps people. Some people focus on political correctness, the more ideological critics of higher education. The financial critics, focus on the self-perpetuating tenure system and endless growth, apparently, of bureaucracy and cost. But I suspect there's some relationship of those two.
Well, there is a incredible conformity, and there is sort of the questions of how are you training people to think in different ways have really gotten lost sight of. I think it is striking how little of a focus there is on teaching in general, and there is sort of the subtle point where something goes from a not great system into an all-out racket, where how much sense does it make for professors to really invest in their graduate students and PhD programs when there's a sense that none of these people will get jobs anymore anyway? Right. And so I think you are sort of in this zone of where it has in many ways become this incredible racket, and it is hard to really know what people inside it think.
And I think just objectively, people say it's the best system ever, but just as an obvious matter, people are not as well educated today as they were, the elites at least, 70 or 80 years ago. People know fewer languages, they memorize less poetry, they're less familiar with history and just literature. I mean, just in very obvious ways, someone graduating, certainly from European universities, but maybe from American universities as well, just seems to me had a better education, leaving entirely aside politics here,
yes.
Than today, which is just sort of amazing. You'd think someone should be able, and that strikes me as also ripe for challenge. If someone set themselves up and said, we're going to really educate, this would be K through 12 too, obviously, we're going to provide a real education. Mm-hmm. There's no reason young people in 2014 should be less well educated than a young person was in 1914, but it's evidently the case in many ways,
Yes, well, there is sort of an egalitarian assumption embedded in education where it's assumed that everyone is more or less the same, and therefore, if you look at how well do people do who graduate from Harvard versus people who just have a high school diploma, and let's say they make twice as much money per year if they graduate from Harvard as with a high school diploma, it's assumed that this is prima facie evidence of how great the Harvard education is. When I think the reality is much more that it's a super selective selection effect, and so there's selection, there's signaling, relatively little sort of value-added learning. But because we have this egalitarian mindset, it's sort of hard to make the argument that it is just this selection rather than a value-added learning. The obvious way to illustrate this would be if you said that the top universities in the U.S. were doing as good a job as they claim, the most natural thing for them to do would be to increase enrollment. So if you say you have 1,600 people a year going to Harvard and we're offering them a fantastic education that's making them much better than they otherwise would have been, could you sort of have some structured growth plan where you increase that number to maybe 3,000 over 20 years? Certainly the population of the country is a lot larger.
Right.
It's attracting people from all over the world. And so, so if you're offering such a great education, what sort of a product is it that where you wouldn't increase the number of people who use it? I mean, I think the only product I can think of where you would limit access as much would be a nightclub, which is sort of again a zero-sum product that's based on exclusion. And I think that if you went to any of these top universities and you proposed doubling the enrollment, you would get a uniform opposition from the alumni, from the current students, from the faculty, because they would rightly perceive that it would make it less prestigious, even though that sort of goes very much against this egalitarian ethos that everyone's the same.
Yeah, so that's a good contrarian point of view that you're taking there on higher education.
But I think the rhetoric around education is always that it's a positive-sum game, because there's this naive intuition that, knowledge, if I know something and I teach it to you, we both will know it, and so there's something about knowledge that's fundamentally this incredibly positive-sum aspect. And I think it masks the very zero-sum aspect of education. I mean, I went to law school, and if you look at the law schools, it's there's this brutal ranking on the U.S. News and World Report scale, where the top three I think are still very good. So if you go to Harvard, Stanford, or Yale, that's really good. Then I think there's sort of 4 after that are pretty good, and then there's sort of the numbers 8 to 14, where maybe if you're in the top half of the class, and then probably numbers 15 to 200. It's very unclear whether it's a positive value for anybody who goes, or for bottom 90% of those classes.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how fast the law school situation seems to have changed in 5 or 10 years, which does make one wonder whether the apparent stability of higher ed in general, or I'd say education in general, or I'd say even more generally, whole chunks of the culture and of our institutions that seem so impervious to change, government would be another one. You do wonder whether, they can chug along for longer than one thinks, but then when things really hit, when things begin to change, it could all change faster than one thinks.
So I think when I've looked at this, I think in the 1980s and 1990s, one saw rapidly escalating costs in education, but also increasing inequality in our society, and so it was at least correlated. It was always worth going to the top college because you'd make more money and it would sort of seemingly make up for it. Post 2000, even though there still is a vast gulf between high school graduates and college graduates, it stopped widening. The costs have kept going up, and so the relative value of a college education has actually been going down since about 2000. If you say we're to measure the value of a college education by how many years does it take you to pay off your debt, the number of years was actually going down in the 80s and 90s because the premium was going up even faster than the costs were escalating. Post 2000, it's taking longer and longer to pay off the debt. So the relative premium has been in decline for 14 years now. And I think again 2008 was a bit of a watershed moment where all of a sudden there were sort of a lot fewer of these tracked positions available. When kids graduate from college and move back in with their parents, that was not part of the deal the parents had implicitly signed.
It sounds like it's a sector of American life ripe for new founders to come along and do things as you did in tech and in Silicon Valley. But is it possible? I mean, could one?
It's certainly it's incredibly distorted. It's one of the things that makes the education bubble different from, say, the housing or the tech bubble of the last decades, is that it is actually very hard to measure what the quality of education is. And so when people say things like, you'll figure it out in 20 years, there are things you will learn that are intangible but will help you 20 years in the future, somewhat cynical cut on that might be that, well, this is the sort of thing you say if you're running a scam, where you want to have a really long shelf life to it so people won't notice that they've been defrauded for a long time. But there is something about the immeasurability of education that's made the education bubble quite durable. But on the other hand, it probably also means that it's gotten bigger and bigger in a way that's extremely distorted. But I think we are at a point where it's going to start changing, and our backgrounds are in these elite universities. You went to Harvard, I went to Stanford. I think those are the ones that will be the last to change, and so we may be underestimating how much change is going to be happening in the next 5-10 years in this very broad swath of colleges where the cost-benefit calculation is not working in any sense of the word anymore.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with that. But I do wonder also, even for elite students, if you think of the product as education as opposed to going to college, whether one won't over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, people will get educated in very different ways. Much less of it will focus on what actually happens in these accredited institutions of higher education, or maybe even K-12, or maybe the institutions will have to change, therefore, a lot in terms of...
Well, it is a question whether there's a question how good are the elite institutions even for the people who go there.
Right.
So one of my friends who started at Yale in 2001, the dean welcomed him to the class by saying, "Congratulations, you're set for life. You got into Yale." And this is 17 years old. This seems slightly off. Like maybe it's true as long as you absolutely never believe it to be true. But if you actually were to believe that, it's probably quite toxic. And so I think that
and insofar as it tracks people into probably safe trajectories, which may not turn out so great, as you said, you're not so sure if it's even true at that level anymore.
Yeah, I suspect that there's the K through 12 tracking to the elite universities sets people up in ways where when things don't quite work out automatically for them afterwards, they're not that resilient, they're not that able to recover. There is an amazing degree to which people's ambitions get beaten out of them in these top universities. If I look at what people thought my senior year in high school, sort of like were very ambitious, they had all these ideas what they were going to do, and if you looked at the same people at sort of college plus 5 years, sort of 9 years later, let's say, it was amazing how much things have been ratcheted down. And so I do think there's something problematic where all the talented people go to these schools, they're sort of evaluated on the same terms, and at the end a lot of ambitions are beaten out of them. Probably the one that I think is even worse for people than Harvard in this respect might be Caltech, where you have these brilliant math, physics people, and after 4 years where you're in the middle of your class, you're convinced that the most you can do with your life is become a line engineer at Lockheed, and maybe you can go into mid-level management 20 years later. And so that sort of is characteristic of what I think has happened. And what I think we need to somehow find a way back to is this idea that that there's not just a single track, that there are very different things you can do. The question, what truth do you know that nobody agrees with you on? The sort of career version of this is what are you really good at that other people aren't that good at, or something like that, and that somehow gets discouraged by this incredible homogenization.
And big ambitions get discouraged, I think. Don't you think? Everyone, and it's true of all of us, I suppose. We decide we can make it in a certain line and do things a little, move ahead step by step, but the kind of
there's always
the ambition to be a founder. That, to come back to what we were talking about earlier, that seems to be knocked out. Both the institutions and the mindset that permeates the institutions is almost a denial that ambition is reasonable or even possible.
Well, there's a sense that there are all these people who are ahead of you. So there's always this sense there's so many people who are much better than you or just as good as you. So who are you to think that you can do anything different? And obviously, when everybody starts to think that, nobody does anything. And in fact, it becomes self-fulfilling once again, and no one does anything different.